Well, good evening, everyone. It's been about a week. I think it was last Sunday night we were here. But I've had something prepared and something that's been sitting on my tablet all week, but it just didn't seem it was the right time to bring it up. So we're going to bring it up tonight. We're talking about Scripture. Of course, that's what we do. It's what we're here for. This is Daily Living, chapter and verse. I saw something on Facebook this week that said, always be willing to let the Scriptures change your mind when you must. Don't interpret the Bible to match what you already want it to say. Let's go over to Acts chapter 5, verse 29. And I'm not totally sure on the circumstances of this. I believe Peter and the apostles were before the scribes or Pharisees. But it says, then Peter and the apostles answered and said, we ought rather to obey God than man. So, there's a lot in the Old Testament that if we were to go and look at how God's law in the Old Testament applies to today, many things are legislated. There's laws allowing certain things in today's society that were unlawful or sinful in the Old Testament. And just a little note I wrote to myself says, man's laws do not override God's laws. If God's law labels certain actions as sinful or an abomination, man's legislation legalizing those actions in no way changes God's law. There are certain things, let's just say man legalizes stealing and lying. God's law teaches against it because man's laws allow you to do something that God's law says is a sin or an abomination. God's law overrides man's law when it comes to our judgment. Now, what are you going to do? Stand before God? Stand before Christ on Judgment Day and say, well, it was legal for me to do this? We're going to be judged on God's laws, not man's. In the Old Testament, or even in the New Testament, adultery is against God's law. However, there are certain laws, even I think in the state of Kentucky, adultery is still illegal, but no one's ever prosecuted on it. So what are you going to do? Stand before God one day and say, well, it's okay they don't prosecute it here. That's how I live. So God, you have to judge me by man's laws, the laws that I lived under. God doesn't have to do anything. That's a losing argument. And there's so many things that this applies to. One of the biggest things I heard a couple of weeks ago was a preacher saying, yes, there are certain things in the Old Testament under the law that Jesus did not teach against. And some of those things are true. Jesus did not teach against some of the things that were unholy or an abomination in the Old Testament. Let me read to you what Matthew 5:17 and 18 says. Think not that I am come to destroy the law. This is Jesus speaking. Or the prophets. I am not come to destroy them, but to fulfill them. Now keep in mind, there are people that say things are okay under the New Testament that were not under the Old Testament because Christ did not teach or preach against them. Let's look at verse 18 of Matthew 5. For truly I say unto you, till heaven and earth perish, not one jot or one tittle of the law shall not escape until all things be fulfilled. What Christ was saying in this verse here, if it's under the law, those laws will exist and be in effect until the end of days. And so man can legislate all he wants and take something that the Bible said was sinful or an abomination, and it does not override God's law. We will all be judged according to God's law, not man's law. How does that apply to your life? Get into the scripture for yourself. Judge yourself against the word. And remember, man's laws cannot override God's laws. You will be judged. I will be judged. We will all be judged according to God's law. Until next time, he that has an ear to hear, let him hear.